The world of Alistair Vance was built on cold, hard numbers and absolute control. From his penthouse office at Vance Global, the city looked like just another board game waiting to be won, and Alistair was a master at winning. But the reading of his late grandfather's will shattered his perfectly calculated existence in a matter of minutes. The old man, manipulative even from beyond the grave, had added a bizarre clause. Alistair had exactly 30 days to marry, or the controlling shares of the empire would default to his resentful, reckless half-brother Tristan. Alistair was furious. He had no time for romance, and even less for women who only wanted his money. He needed a wife who would sign a contract, stay out of his way, and disappear when the time was right. His eyes landed on Clara Belmont. She was his newly hired personal assistant, a woman who had spent the last 2 weeks being entirely ignored by him and despised by the rest of the executive floor for her simple clothes and quiet demeanor. Clara was invisible, which made her the perfect candidate for a business arrangement. He called her into his office, expecting her to tremble under his gaze as she usually did when he barked orders. Instead, when he laid out the proposal offering her $2 million for 1 year of a fake marriage, she did not flinch. She looked at the contract, then slid it back across his pristine glass desk. She told him she did not want his money, but she would do it if he agreed to anonymously fund a struggling children's shelter she volunteered at. Alistair was taken aback. For the first time, he really looked at her, noticing the fierce determination in her eyes. He tried to intimidate her, leaning over the desk and warning her that she had no idea what his world entailed. Clara simply smiled coldly and told him that his world seemed incredibly empty, and she was only visiting. The wedding was a sterile affair in a private courtroom. There were no flowers, no tears of joy, just the scratching of a pen on a legal document. Tristan was there, watching from the back of the room with a sneer that promised trouble. When Alistair placed the diamond ring on Clara's finger, her hand was surprisingly steady. As they walked out to face the paparazzi, Alistair pulled her close for the cameras, whispering that she belonged to Vance Global now. Clara whispered back that she belonged to no one, stepping into the waiting limousine with a grace that left him momentarily speechless. Living together in his sprawling penthouse brought unexpected friction. Alistair tried to buy her compliance with a closet full of designer gowns and expensive jewelry. Clara left the boxes unopened in the hallway, continuing to wear her simple sweaters. They clashed constantly over his arrogance, but there were quiet moments too. One night after a grueling board meeting, Alistair found Clara asleep on the sofa, a cold cup of coffee on the table, and his favorite obscure jazz record playing softly in the background. Without thinking, he draped a blanket over her shoulders, lingering just a moment to brush a stray lock of hair from her face. Another time, when Clara fell ill with a terrible fever, Alistair cancelled a multi-million-dollar negotiation just to sit by her bed, forcing her to drink water and holding her hand until the fever broke. The fragile peace shattered when Alistair's private investigator, originally hired to keep tabs on Tristan's shady dealings, dropped a bombshell file on Alistair's desk. Clara Belmont was not a poor, struggling assistant. She was the sole heiress to the Belmont shipping fortune, a woman who had famously vanished from high society 5 years ago after her family's ruthless corporate tactics ruined thousands of lives. Alistair felt a cold fury wash over him. He confronted her that evening, throwing the file onto the kitchen island. He accused her of mocking him, of playing a game just to see the great Alistair Vance make a fool of himself. Clara did not yell. Her voice broke as she explained the agonizing truth. She had walked away from her billions because she could not stomach the blood on her family's money. She had given up everything to live a clean, honest life. The fact that Alistair thought she was a spy hurt her more than any of his previous insults. The air between them turned to ice. For weeks they moved around the penthouse like ghosts, but the silence punished Alistair more than he cared to admit. He began to leave her small peace offerings. Not diamonds, but her favorite jasmine tea left brewing on the counter, or a rare first edition of a book she had mentioned in passing. Before the ice could fully melt, Tristan made his final move. Having caught wind of Clara's true identity, Tristan called an emergency board meeting. He brought reporters and investors, planning to expose Clara's past and frame their marriage as a fraudulent scheme orchestrated by the Belmont family to swallow Vance Global. Tristan stood at the head of the boardroom, gloating as he prepared to destroy Alistair's reputation and claim the company. But Alistair did not let Clara face the wolves alone. He stood up, taking her hand in front of the flashing cameras. He did not deny who she was. Instead, he presented the board with the other file his investigator had compiled, the one detailing Tristan's extensive embezzlement and offshore accounts used to siphon company funds. The room erupted in shock. Tristan's smug smile vanished as security was called to escort him out of the building. He was stripped of his titles and left with nothing, publicly humiliated in front of the very people he had tried to manipulate. Later that evening, the penthouse was quiet. Clara was packing her single suitcase, assuming the contract was essentially over now that the threat was gone. Alistair stopped her at the door. He did not use his wealth or his power to make her stay. He simply stripped away his pride, looked into her eyes, and apologized. He confessed that his world had been entirely empty before she arrived, just as she had predicted, and that he did not want to rule an empire if she was not by his side. It was a declaration of love entirely devoid of his usual arrogance. Clara let go of the suitcase, finally allowing herself to believe him, and they shared their first real, lingering kiss. The years went by, bringing changes that neither could have predicted. They did not need a contract anymore. On a warm summer afternoon, they stood on the terrace of a small seaside home they had built together, far away from the corporate battlefield. Clara was laughing, a genuine bright sound, as Alistair wrapped his arms around her waist, completely at peace. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to hear a good story about love conquering pride. Subscribe to the channel to follow our next stories. We will see you next time. Sebastian Kane ruled Kane Enterprises with an iron grip and a heart made of calculating ambition. His life was a series of acquisitions and mergers, leaving no room for anything as unpredictable as human emotion. However, his latest and most crucial expansion into the Asian markets hit an unexpected wall. The conservative investors demanded stability and traditional values. They wanted a family man at the helm, not a notorious bachelor known for his ruthless corporate warfare. Sebastian was given an ultimatum to find a presentable wife within the week, or the multi-billion-dollar deal would collapse. He found his solution at a high society charity gala. Margot Ellis was standing alone near the ice sculpture, her chin held high despite the venomous whispers surrounding her. She was the recent ex-fiancée of Julian Ashford, Sebastian's most hated corporate rival. Julian had publicly discarded Margot for a wealthier heiress, leaving her to face the wolves of high society. Sebastian saw an opportunity. He approached her, his tone perfectly detached, and offered her a proposition. He would marry her, providing her with impenetrable social armor and the ultimate revenge against Julian, and in return, she would play the role of a devoted wife to secure his merger. Margot did not flinch under his predatory gaze. She looked at his outstretched hand, then up into his cold eyes and told him that she would sign his contract, but he would never own her. She refused his offer of a limitless credit card, stating she only needed the legal protection of his name, nothing more. Their wedding was a quiet, sterile affair, followed immediately by Margot moving into his sprawling, modern estate. The house was cold and empty, much like the man who owned it. Margot refused to be intimidated by the wealth that surrounded her. When Sebastian ordered a designer wardrobe to replace her modest clothing, she politely instructed the staff to return every single box. She wore her own clothes, asserting a quiet but unbending independence that frustrated and fascinated him. Observing this dynamic from the shadows was Vanessa Sterling, Sebastian's manipulative ex-fiancée, who felt that the title of Mrs. Kane rightfully belonged to her. Living under the same roof brought inevitable friction. They traded sharp words over morning coffee, their conversations a battlefield of disguised emotions and power plays. Yet, amidst the tension, small cracks began to appear in their armor. Late one evening, during a severe thunderstorm that knocked out the power, Margot accidentally shattered a glass in the dark kitchen, slicing her hand. Sebastian found her bleeding by the counter. Instead of calling for the staff, he carefully washed and bandaged her wound himself, his touch surprisingly gentle. They sat on the kitchen floor in the dark, sharing a fleeting moment of vulnerability that neither was willing to voice aloud. The fragile truce shattered when Vanessa Sterling decided to make her move. Digging into Margot's past, Vanessa discovered a devastating secret and sent the files directly to Sebastian. Margot was not just a discarded fiancée. She was the daughter of Richard Ellis, the owner of a modest manufacturing firm that Kane Enterprises had ruthlessly crushed and absorbed a decade ago. The hostile takeover had bankrupted her family and sent her father into an early grave. Sebastian confronted Margot in his study, the files scattered across his mahogany desk. He accused her of marrying him out of a long-term desire for vengeance, of being a corporate spy plotting to destroy his empire from the inside. Margot did not yell, but tears of bitter anger welled in her eyes. She confessed the agonizing truth. She had not planned any revenge, but walking into his house every day, living off the wealth that was built on the ashes of her father's life, was a daily torment. She had accepted the marriage only to survive the social ruin Julian had left her in, forced to seek shelter with the very monster who had destroyed her past. The revelation hung heavily between them. For days they existed in heavy, punishing silence. Sebastian retreated into his work, but his usual ruthlessness felt hollow. He realized the true cost of his empire. Slowly he tried to bridge the gap. He stopped buying her expensive, meaningless gifts. Instead, he made sure the kitchen was stocked with the specific roast of coffee she loved, and he began cancelling late-night board meetings just to be in the same house with her, offering his presence as a silent apology. Vanessa, infuriated that her revelation had not caused an immediate divorce, decided to strike publicly. At the final gala meant to celebrate the signing of the Asian merger, Vanessa bypassed security and marched toward the international investors with a dossier in her hand. She intended to expose Margot's past to the press, framing her as a vengeful saboteur and ruining the traditional family image Sebastian had built. Before Vanessa could hand over the documents, Sebastian stepped directly into her path, shielding Margot from the flashing cameras. He took the microphone and addressed the ballroom. He publicly acknowledged the sins of his company's past, admitting to the ruthless destruction of the Ellis family. He then declared that Margot had shown him the emptiness of his own ambition. But Sebastian was not finished. He signaled his security team, who handed a different folder to the investors. It contained irrefutable proof that Vanessa had been illegally short-selling Kane stock and attempting to sabotage the merger for her own financial gain. The room erupted in gasps. The investors turned their backs on Vanessa in disgust. Stripped of her social standing and facing federal investigation, Vanessa fled the gala, utterly humiliated and abandoned by the very elite circle she had tried to manipulate. Later that night, standing on the balcony of their estate, Sebastian turned to Margot. He stripped away all his pride, his voice devoid of its usual arrogant edge. He apologized not just for his past assumptions, but for the pain his legacy had caused her family. He promised to spend the rest of his life making amends, offering her a true partnership built on respect, rather than a cold contract. Margot looked into the eyes of the man who had once been her family's undoing, and saw only the man who had defended her against the world. She reached out, taking his hand, and forgave him. Time healed the deep wounds of the past. A year later, Margot launched her own independent philanthropic foundation, funded by a massive, unconditional grant from Kane Enterprises. She stood at the podium of her opening charity event, radiating confidence and grace. Sebastian stood proudly in the front row, watching his wife change the world, knowing that his greatest victory was not a corporate merger, but winning her heart. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to hear a good story about love conquering the darkest of pasts. Subscribe to the channel to follow our next stories. We will see you next time. Theodore Lang built his life on predictability, ruling Lang Holdings with a cold detachment that terrified his board of directors. But predictability vanished the moment a runaway delivery truck careened toward him on a crowded city intersection. He braced for impact, but a pair of small, fierce hands shoved him out of the way just in time. The cameras of nearby paparazzi, always stalking the billionaire, captured the moment perfectly. By evening, the image of the ruthless Theodore Lang being saved by a common citizen was on every screen in the country. His public relations team saw an unprecedented opportunity to soften his tyrannical corporate image before a critical federal antitrust hearing. They drafted a marriage contract. The woman who saved him was Sienna Hayes, an emergency room nurse who worked double shifts and had no patience for entitled billionaires. When Theodore summoned her to his penthouse and slid a contract across the table offering her $5 million for a one-year marriage, she laughed in his face. She told him his money could not buy her dignity and turned to leave. But Theodore, unaccustomed to the word no, noticed the slight tremor in her hands and the exhaustion in her eyes. He challenged her, stating that a nurse could surely use the funds to save more lives than she currently did. Sienna stopped. She agreed to sign, but only if the money was placed in an irrevocable trust for the pediatric ward she worked in. She refused to take a single dime for herself. The wedding took place in a sterile municipal office, devoid of any warmth or celebration. Sienna wore a simple dress she already owned, refusing the designer gowns Theodore had sent to her small apartment. Standing in the back of the room was Marcus Devereux, the corrupt family lawyer who managed the Lang estate. Marcus watched the quiet bride with narrowed eyes, calculating how this sudden marriage would interfere with his long-term plan to drain the company's private offshore accounts. When Theodore leaned in to kiss his new bride for the cameras, Sienna remained rigid, her eyes flashing a clear warning that the performance ended the moment the doors closed. Life in the penthouse became a battlefield of wills. Theodore tried to control her schedule, demanding she attend galas and dinners. Sienna defied him at every turn, continuing her grueling hospital shifts and arriving at his pristine dinner parties in her worn sneakers. Yet the forced proximity began to chip away at their defenses. One evening, Theodore returned early to find Sienna asleep on the rug, a medical textbook resting on her chest. He did not wake her. Instead, he quietly placed a pillow beneath her head and draped his heavy cashmere coat over her shivering frame. It was a silent admission that he noticed her, beyond the contract. The delicate balance collapsed entirely when Theodore walked into the guest bathroom and found a hidden cache of highly specialized medication. He immediately demanded answers. Sienna, cornered and exhausted, finally revealed the agonizing truth. She was battling a rare, progressive heart condition. The grueling double shifts were not just for her patients, but to secure experimental treatments she could barely afford. She had hidden the illness because she refused to be anyone's burden, especially not a man who viewed her as a public relations prop. The revelation terrified Theodore, though he masked his fear with icy anger. He accused her of breaching the contract by withholding critical information. For weeks, a punishing silence settled over the penthouse. Theodore retreated to his office, working through the night to avoid facing the fragility of the woman he was slowly realizing he cared for. But his coldness was a facade. He began leaving her specific organic juices every morning, the kind meant to aid her medication absorption. He secretly bought the pharmaceutical company developing her cure, ensuring she received the best care without ever knowing he was the one pulling the strings. While Theodore was distracted by his silent panic, Marcus Devereux saw his chance to strike. The lawyer had managed to plant listening devices in the penthouse and recorded Sienna talking to her doctor about her failing health. Marcus planned to leak the audio to the board of directors, framing Theodore as dangerously distracted and mentally unfit to lead the company while his new wife was secretly dying. Marcus intended to trigger a leadership vote and seize control of the trust funds in the ensuing chaos. The board was summoned for an emergency vote, but Marcus never got to play his recording. As the lawyer stood to address the room, Theodore walked in, holding a digital voice recorder of his own. He pressed play and the room echoed with Marcus's voice, not discussing Sienna, but arranging the transfer of millions of dollars from the Lang pension fund into a private shell company. Theodore had realized the lawyer's betrayal weeks ago and quietly set a trap. The police entered the boardroom immediately, handcuffing Marcus in front of the stunned executives. The corrupt lawyer was dragged away, his reputation in ruins and his freedom gone. With the threat eliminated, Theodore rushed back to the penthouse. He found Sienna standing by the window, packing her bag. He did not yell or try to order her to stay. He simply walked up to her, his voice breaking for the first time in his life, and asked for her forgiveness. He confessed that he had acted coldly because he was terrified of losing her, that his empire meant nothing if it could not keep her safe. He told her he did not just want a public relations victory, he wanted a real life with her. Sienna looked at the man who had laid his heart bare. seeing past the billionaire facade to the vulnerable man underneath, and finally dropped her bag. 2 years later, the sterile contract was a distant memory. They stood under a beautiful floral arch in the garden of their new home, surrounded by friends and the children from Sienna's hospital ward. It was a real wedding this time, filled with warmth and genuine laughter. Sienna was glowing, her health fully restored thanks to the treatment, and Theodore looked at her as if she were the only person in the world. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to hear a good story about true love and second chances. Subscribe to the channel to follow our next stories. We will see you next time.
The infographic serves as a profound psychological and social roadmap for 3 narratives where the calculating world of corporate empires collides with the unpredictable nature of human vulnerability. Across all 3 stories, the central characters begin their journeys hidden behind walls of immense wealth, rigid control, and deep emotional isolation. They view relationships exclusively through the lens of business transactions, utilizing marriage as a strategic tool to secure family inheritances, appease conservative foreign investors, or repair damaged public images. However, as the infographic illustrates, these contractual foundations are merely catalysts that force these emotionally guarded men to confront their own psychological defenses when faced with women who completely refuse to be bought or intimidated by their power. In the case of Alistair Vance and Clara Belmont, the analysis highlights a fundamental clash between absolute arrogance and quiet authenticity. Alistair initially operates under the delusion that everything in life has a concrete price tag. Clara, who actively walked away from the exact same toxic environment of inherited wealth, represents a psychological mirror he refuses to look into at first. The infographic points out that the true turning point of their dynamic is not a grand romantic gesture, but the gradual dismantling of their false identities. When Alistair finally drops his pride to publicly protect her from his malicious brother, he is fundamentally rejecting the emotionally bankrupt legacy of his grandfather. His journey represents a psychological shift from equating power with control to realizing that true strength actually lies in humility and emotional transparency. Moving to the darker dynamic of Sebastian Cain and Margot Ellis, the infographic dissects the devastating emotional toll of corporate ruthlessness. This relationship starts as a mutual survival tactic but is deeply poisoned by the historical trauma Sebastian previously inflicted on Margot's family. The social and psychological themes here revolve around vengeance, overwhelming guilt, and the monumental effort required for genuine forgiveness. The visual guide emphasizes how Sebastian's realization of the human cost of his blind ambition breaks his predatory nature. When he actively chooses to publicly dismantle his own corporate mythology to protect Margot from further public ruin, he begins the long process of healing the very wounds he caused. Their narrative proves that mutual care and accountability can override even the darkest history of betrayal. The analysis of Theodore Lang and Sienna Hayes explores the psychological battle between the illusion of absolute control and the chaotic reality of human frailty. Theodore attempts to use Sienna as a pristine public relations prop to mask his tyrannical nature, completely unaware that she is fighting a desperate hidden battle for her own life. The infographic underscores how Sienna's progressive heart condition introduces a terrifying element of uncontrollable chaos into Theodore's meticulously curated existence. Her illness forces him to experience the paralyzing fear of loss, effectively stripping away his robotic shell. By channeling his immense corporate resources towards saving her rather than fueling his own selfish ambition, he surrenders his desperate need for control in order to embrace genuine love. Together, the analysis of these 3 intertwined sagas demonstrates a powerful unifying lesson. Whether battling fierce arrogance, a dark history of corporate destruction, or the terrifying unpredictability of a terminal illness, the characters prove that contractual pragmatism will always fail in the face of genuine human connection. The infographic maps out how the difficult transition from emotional isolation to mutual vulnerability is the ultimate redemption for these men, illustrating that the most valuable asset they could ever acquire is the courage to love without conditions.